Well, it's never too late to plan for the future, and especially in college football recruiting. If you're not always recruiting and if you're not always closing, then you're too late. And LSU has proved that today. They landed their first commitment of the 2023 season. What exactly are the Tigers getting out of their defensive back commitment? We'll break down all of that. Plus, John Garcia, a recruiting insider for Sports Illustrated, joins us in the show talking the 2022 class. What can LSU see immediate production from? And also planning ahead for the 2023 and 2024 classes as well. All of that and more on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Spotify, whether that's Apple Podcasts, or whatever your preferred podcast platform may be. You can find us there. Plus, we're also on YouTube. So if you're hanging at home, if you want to watch the podcast, feel free to do that on YouTube, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Locked On LSU. You'll get notified as soon as the podcasts drop. So make sure to follow along there. You can also follow along on Twitter. You can follow my personal Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. I'll post my sports takes. I'll post podcast updates. I'll post my LSU takes as well as at Locked On LSU on Twitter. I'll post links to the YouTube podcast as well on there, so make sure to follow along as well. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I am an LSU graduate. I am a diehard LSU fan, all things purple and gold, and I am now a sports talk radio host here in Nashville, Tennessee on ESPN 102.5 The Game. I cover all things NFL, NHL, college football, you name it, we cover it. But first and foremost, LSU landing their first commitment of the 2023 class, a four-star defensive back out of Georgia. Michael Daugherty announced his verbal commitment to LSU today. And LSU has been kind of in his rotation of schools. He's been interested in LSU for quite some time now. So albeit it is a verbal commitment, I do feel fairly certain that this is a real commitment there, because I had wishy-washy commitments here and there. But it does feel like since LSU has been in the mix for quite some time, that Michael Daugherty could be here to stay. And it could be very important because defensive back depth is something that is of utmost importance for LSU. Of course, he's coming in the 2023 season, so obviously not an immediate help there in the defensive back depth. But that's a position group that had some much-needed depth. I mean, you saw so many LSU defensive backs, corners, and safeties leaving in the transfer portal, and that's always a position group that is touted so heavily from LSU. So getting even more depth, especially a guy with such a long body like Michael Daugherty, I believe 6'1", and he's a long, tall, physical defensive back, great ball skills, and that secondary is really looking to kind of boost its future. This is a team that is built to prepare for the future. I mean, you look at the quarterback room, for example. That's a quarterback room that is built for the next 3, 4, 5 years even. So this is a team that's not only picking up immediate needs in the transfer portal now, but also planning for the future very much so. But John Garcia will join us in the show. He's a recruiting insider for Sports Illustrated. Knows all things recruiting, all things transfer portal. We'll get his thoughts on Michael Daugherty and also a couple more players that are planning their scheduling their visits, rather. Dante Moore and Carnell Tate, a 5-star quarterback and the number 2 wide receiver in the country, respectively. They are scheduling their official visits to LSU, so some big-time depth and strength there coming into LSU. So we'll get John Garcia's thoughts on that. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Athletic Greens, because I'm always on the go, and it's really kind of difficult for me to sit down and prepare a full meal and get all the nutrients that I need, but it's really like a very important thing for me to make sure that I'm taking care of my body and getting what I need. I've been on it for 2 weeks now, and I absolutely love it. It doesn't taste like it's super healthy, because you know the gross smoothies or green juices that just taste like vegetables? That's not the case here with Athletic Greens. It has kind of a mild, kind of tropical taste. It's very fruity, and I look forward to it each morning. So exactly what is Athletic Greens? It's a scoop of AG1 with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. They have a special blend of ingredients for gut health, nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All the things that you need, all the good things. Plus, if you have some dietary restrictions or it may be a little bit difficult for you to find things on the go that are easy for you to eat, well, check out Athletic Greens because it's lifestyle friendly, whether it's keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, gluten-free. I have plenty of friends that are dairy-free and gluten-free, and they just have the hardest time trying to find good and healthy snacks on the go, and Athletic Greens has been the solution for them. They support better sleep quality, recovery, supports mental clarity and alertness. I know sometimes in the middle of the day, I get a little bit of brain fog, and you kind of get that 2 p.m., 3 p.m. crash, but Athletic Greens is there to give you a boost there. So try out Athletic Greens. It is fairly inexpensive. It costs you less than $3 a day. So ditch your Starbucks habit, ditch your iced coffee habit, and replace it with Athletic Greens instead. So right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. It's just 1 scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. Super easy. No need for a million different pills and supplements and all these different cups and shakers to look out for your health. Make it easy. Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/college. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/college to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first to listen every day. Now, a big announcement starting Thursday, April 28th. Tune in to Locked On NFL Draft's live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft with 3 days of real-time analysis from our extensive lineup of experts and insiders. For those of you dying to know who your team is going to take, catch Odyssey and Locked On's NFL Mock Draft special hosted by Brian Peacock and former scout Matt Williamson of the Peacock and Williamson NFL show all week leading up to the first pick. So you can watch the Locked On NFL Draft live show on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube page on April 28th, 29th, and 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and 11:30 a.m. Eastern, respectively. You can watch the Odyssey NFL Mock Draft show on Odyssey and the Locked On NFL Draft podcast feeds on April 28th through 22nd and also April 25th. So we have a very special guest joining us now. John Garcia, who is a recruiting insider for Sports Illustrated, joins us now. Now, first and foremost, John, my first question for you is, what is your first impression of this LSU 2022 recruiting class? What do you think that they're going to be able to get from that recruiting class this season as they enter their rookie season?
Well, it was a strong close for Brian Kelly and company. Obviously, transitioning from Notre Dame, not very easy to do. Limited timetable, the early signing day, and then the second signing day, but all things considered, a strong group and a strong group of Louisianans, which is not something that maybe everyone expected given Kelly's credentials outside of the Southern footprint. But 10 of the 15 signings were from Louisiana, and a lot of the transfers had Louisiana roots as well. So I think that really helped out the class. But the signature get was Harold Perkins. I mean, going into Texas and picking up a linebacker at Texas A&M, Texas, Alabama, everybody wanted it, was really the signature win for Kelly and company. And I think he's going to see the field relatively early.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. I think that was a concern that I had, and I think a lot of other LSU fans had whenever the Brian Kelly hiring was announced, was his ability to recruit in the Southeast, because he had only ever coached and mainly recruited in the Northeast and in the Midwest. So your first impressions, he's been able to pull kids from Louisiana, which at LSU is a priority. We call it the boys from the boot, keeping those boys in state. And also you mentioned Texas, Harold Perkins, a huge linebacker get for the LSU Tigers, but also recruiting in Florida and Georgia and Alabama and competing with other schools in the SEC. Your first impression in Brian Kelly's ability to recruit in the Southeast?
He's going to contend. We know this. Obviously, Nick Saban is the king of recruiting, maybe in general, and certainly in pulling Louisianans out of the state. Mm-hmm. And Kelly knows this. He spoke to Ross Dellinger, a colleague of mine recently, big story that went out today, and he acknowledged it. He said, look, in northern Louisiana, Monroe to Shreveport, they've got to be better. And that's where Alabama's been able to come in and take some prime talent, including several last year. So we'll see now with his first full cycle ahead of him, how he can combat that and start to keep those guys home. So it's not just a volume thing. You've got to keep the top kids home, of course. And Brian Kelly knows that. And I think that's part of the reason why he came to LSU, because the pool of player is right in his backyard, something that he really didn't have an advantage of taking advantage of at Notre Dame.
You also mentioned the transfer portal, because I've been incredibly impressed by what Brian Kelly has been able to do within the transfer portal, because as much as it has hurt LSU, seeing some of their top players leaving through the transfer portal, Brian Kelly has also done a very good job of bringing, like you mentioned, Louisiana kids back to LSU, and also most notably Jaden Daniels, Arizona State quarterback, transferring into LSU. So your impressions, not only on Jaden Daniels, but at this transfer portal class as a whole as well.
I'll start with Daniels. I was really surprised that he came to LSU.
I was too.
That quarterback room was really solid already without him. But I think that tells you a little bit about Kelly. You have to breed competition at every single position and at every point. So when Daniels became available later in the portal than maybe all the other top quarterbacks, they were all in from the jump, and obviously it paid off. So really curious to see how that pans out, because Daniels was incredibly talented, much like Miles Brennan, much like Garrett Nussmeier. So that would be really interesting to follow. With the rest of the class, again, a lot of Louisianans. I love bringing Noah Kane back to Baton Rouge. Joe Fouch is a New Orleans kid, and it was a big class on top of it. So you also lost talent, but you replaced it with volume and Louisiana guys that had arguably the top portal class in the country, and certainly over a dozen kids coming in will certainly impact your roster given the experience they had at their other schools. So you have to utilize the portal nowadays. So Kelly embracing that from day one, I thought was really critical.
Yeah, and you mentioned Walker Howard, Garrett Nussmeier, Miles Brennan, and also Jaden Daniels coming into the mix. I mean, LSU has a bona fide quarterback competition on their hands. And Brian Kelly said he's not going to rush to name a starter at any position, much less the quarterback position. But knowing what you know about those four guys, especially Walker Howard, a huge quarterback get, an in-state guy for LSU, if you had to choose today on April 14th, who would your starting quarterback be amongst those four?
That's a great question. I love Brennan's experience, and I thought Nussmeier showed well at times last year. But Jaden Daniels has more experience than all of them. He's the most mobile of all of them, and he's probably got the most to prove of all of them, with a clock that is just on a shorter sample than the rest of the guys. So I think he's got the most to prove, and even though he's the newest to the group, I do think he's got the most ahead of him at LSU. And whenever you're transitioning from one roster to the other, there's going to be holes on the offense, right? Maybe the offensive line isn't up to snuff. Maybe the quarterback has more on his plate. So typically, the guy with experience and who's the most mobile is going to win out as the safest bet for your offense right now. Long term, I think it's going to be a true battle with all of these guys. But on the front end, I like Daniel's chance.
And that's what I feel most confident right now, saying that if I had to choose today, I probably would choose Jaden Daniels. Like you mentioned, he does have the most experience. Miles Brennan being out for the past 2 seasons, it makes me nervous bringing him back, especially coming back from injury. And also Jaden Daniels being the most mobile of all of them. But I spoke with the host of Locked On Arizona State, Richie Bradshaw, and he said that one concern of Jaden Daniels is that if he doesn't see the right read from the defense, his go-to is just to run. And maybe there are some accuracy issues there with his arm. Do you see that coming to fruition with Jaden Daniels? And what do you think LSU can do to help him improve with his accuracy?
Well, I think it's going to be an entirely different offense for Jaden with much more talent. No disrespect to Arizona State.
Yeah.
I think those primary reads are going to be a little bit more readily available at a school like LSU, whether it's a slot receiver, running back out of the backfield, what have you. And then you think about the experience and him hopefully self-aware and recognizing, hey, maybe that is an issue. That's something that he could really work to correct this spring. And I think that's where guys who go and get a fresh start somewhere else have a really big advantage, because some of the bad things that maybe were tied into one school or one coordinator or one style all of a sudden go out the window. So you give kids like that the benefit of the doubt.
And that was something that I touched on with Richie, the host of Locked On Sun Devils. And he said, in Jaden Daniels' freshman year, he had some serious threats. He had some serious wide receiver weapons, and then those guys moved on to the NFL draft, and then he was kind of left in that 2020 and 2021 seasons with no wide receivers and really no support on offense. So I agree with you that having Kayshon Boutte in the supporting cast with the rest of the LSU offense, Jack Besh included, that he'll be able to have plenty of more threats in the throwing game, in the air game. But coming up next, John sticks around with us, and we'll talk about some people that are on LSU's radar in the 2023 class, what LSU could potentially be getting, and who their competitors are in the recruiting trail. We'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell y'all about Bet Online, because it is the number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. Last night wrapped up the NBA play-in game, so the NBA playoffs are heating up very much so. So go to betonline.net and make your NBA playoff picks. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. John Garcia, Sports Illustrated recruiting insider, joins us now. So a few names that I want to go over with you, John. First and foremost, LSU just got a verbal commit from 2023 class, 4-star defensive back out of Georgia, Michael Daugherty. So Brian Kelly mentioned that the defensive back position group so far in spring practice really has kind of surprised him as being the most developed, kind of most refined. But I do think that the defensive back position group is one group that needs a lot more depth, albeit Michael Daugherty doesn't come in until the 2023 season. But if, the verbal commit, so, still up in the air. But if he does decide to pursue the purple and gold as his landing spot in college, what do you think the Tigers are getting?
A versatile safety. And in this day and age, Carolina, you can't have enough versatile defensive players. I mean, the game is totally wide open. It's all about playing pass first space type of nature. And that means you have to tackle in space as well. And I think that's where Daugherty really shines at the high school level. Coming off of his junior tape, he plays in the box a lot as a safety. That means his high school coaches trust him to support the run almost like a linebacker. But then you factor in the safety skill and athleticism, and he can play a little bit more in space to combat some of that. So I think covering running backs, covering slot receivers are in his forte as a cover guy, but he's physical enough to come up and support the run. And look, at the end of the day, this is the SEC West, right? Arkansas is going to run the football. Auburn's going to run the football. Bama's going to run the football. You have to be able to control the run game at all three levels. So safeties who can come down and support are incredibly important.
When you say box safety kind of resembles a linebacker, the way that you describe him reminds me a lot of Jamal Adams, which is a name that I think LSU fans know and love. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
That's a lot, right? I mean, Jamal is a great safety, obviously still playing in the NFL. If it's anything in that ballpark, you got to be really happy with the most recent verbal commitment. But yeah, Jamal played the box incredibly well, but also showed that ability to play deep as a true cover guy. So if Daugherty can develop that part of his game and be more balanced, I mean, why not? Let's shoot for the moon with these projections.
Well, I mean, production level, maybe not quite there yet, but just style of play.
Yeah, you need someone who is confident enough to come downhill. And when you think of Jamal Adams at LSU, you think of plays in the backfield, you think of plays at the second level, and of course plays deep. And Daugherty, skill set wise, has that ability to come down in the box and even blitz and time it up really well to make plays in the backfield. It's a wide open game, so he's going to be lining up in all these different places. So if you can attack from different depths, that's really ahead of the curve compared to most high school defensive backs.
Two players that are at the top of their position groups in terms of recruiting rankings that have scheduled their LSU visits. First and foremost, a 5-star quarterback, Dante Moore out of Detroit, just scheduled his official visit with LSU. We just talked so much about Brian Kelly being able to recruit in the South, and here he is pulling a kid from Detroit. He's looking at Michigan, Michigan State, Notre Dame, Penn State. Those are all places that are much closer to home. And I have to believe that Brian Kelly has been recruiting him for quite some time if LSU is thrown in the mix. Do you think that LSU is a legitimate landing spot? I know it's early in his recruitment, but do you think that could be a legitimate landing spot for him?
It could be. You mentioned Notre Dame as one of the top contenders for Dante Moore. Brian Kelly's been on that train for over a year personally. So there's no doubt that LSU is a true contender for Dante. But even in the previous coaching staff, he had visited Baton Rouge. So now he's come back once under Kelly. So this will be his second visit under Kelly there at MBR. And this will be an official visit. So now you're talking 48 hours on LSU's dime, wine and dine, red carpet treatment, all of those things. And I believe this is the first official visit Dante's going to take. So you talk about a first impression in that kind of visit setting, and I think the sky's really the limit. We know this quarterback room is going to be built on competition and built on explosive plays in the SEC. And a quarterback who's very smart like Dante understands the advantages of something like that relative to the Big Ten or Notre Dame or even elsewhere. So if he does go outside of that Midwestern footprint, I do think LSU, maybe Miami, are the programs that take a bit of an advantage.
What does he do best?
His presence. Tall in the pocket, ball distributor, think of a true point guard on the football field, strong arm, all of those things. Much like some of the top quarterbacks he's had at Notre Dame, referring to Brian Kelly. Dante Moore's got that pro style, but he's got a big physical build that is built to compete with tough leagues like the SEC, where D-line are hanging all over and things like that. The kid's got a ton of experience. He's a state champion up in Detroit. Obviously can play in all weather. So there's a lot of intangible qualities to like about Dante beyond a great arm.
Second player who has just scheduled his official visit to LSU, the second-ranked wide receiver in the country, Carnell Tate, taking his official visit to LSU, an IMG kid who's looking across the SEC. What does he do best, and do you think he could fit into this LSU offense?
He's got polish. This is one of the smoothest receivers we've scouted in the last few recruiting cycles. He's got some size on the side as well. 6'2", 6'3", 190 pounds or so, can run every route in the route tree and get on top of the defense as well. When you're the best offensive player at IMG Academy, you can play anyway and against anyone. Right. So Carnell's got all that in his bag, and he's another one that Notre Dame's recruited for such a long time. So now Kelly's recruitment will carry over onto LSU. And look, Carnell is really close to committing to Notre Dame in the fall. Like, we all know this at this point.
Right.
Carnell has admitted that Kelly's move was the biggest coaching change that he's had to experience. So clearly he's a big fan of Brian Kelly and that style. And he's also close to Dante Moore. So you wonder how that dynamic can work out at Notre Dame or at LSU. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get on campus together and start to build more chemistry at another school.
Do you think those two would be a tandem? Because I think that LSU fans look at Jack Bech and Walker Howard, for example, two Louisiana kids coming out of Lafayette, and they were pretty straightforward with saying, we're best friends and we want to go together. Are Dante Moore and Carnell Tate, do you think that they could be a tandem as well?
It's not a home run, but it's surely a possibility. Both Midwest kids, they've come up at the same kind of trajectory as elite national recruits, and they've got a lot of similar schools recruiting too, right? LSU, as we mentioned, Notre Dame, as we mentioned, Michigan, Ohio State. So if they do want to team up and package deal, no team's going to say no to that. But if that is the case, LSU and Notre Dame have the advantage, no doubt.
Which is so crazy that those two schools, I mean, increasingly so over the past couple of years, have always been kind of married to each other, LSU and Notre Dame over the past couple of years. John, we appreciate you so much. How can people find you?
Yeah, real simple. SI.com/college or on Twitter at SI All-American or my handle, John Garcia _JR.
All right, John, we appreciate you and looking forward to having a lot more of you on the podcast in the future.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, John. Again, that was John Garcia. He's a Sports Illustrated recruiting insider. We'll have John on the podcast increasingly so, especially in this offseason as the transfer portal and recruiting heats up even more. But that is going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts.